Growing up feeling invisible left deep scars, but I finally faced my fears and confronted my mother. My story is one of resilience, painful truths, and the power of forgiveness. The silence was always the loudest sound in our house. Not the comfortable silence of shared understanding, but the cavernous, echoing quiet of unspoken needs and unacknowledged pain. For years, decades even, I carried that silence within me, a heavy, invisible cloak that muffled my own voice, dimmed my light, and convinced me I wasn't truly seen, wasn't truly heard, wasn't truly loved. It wasn't a dramatic, explosive neglect you might see in movies, no screaming matches or overt cruelty. No, it was far more insidious, a slow, steady erosion of self-worth born from emotional absence, from the perpetual feeling of being a ghost in my own home. I remember countless nights lying awake, staring at my bedroom ceiling, replaying conversations that never happened, wishing for a touch, a word of comfort, a moment of genuine connection that simply never came. My mother was physically present, yes, a formidable figure in her own way, always busy, always focused on the practicalities of life. She cooked, she cleaned, she made sure I had clothes on my back and food on my plate. But her eyes, whenever they met mine, seemed to look right through me, like I was transparent. It was a gaze that didn't hold warmth, didn't reflect my existence back to me. And in that void, I learned to disappear. I learned that my feelings were inconvenient, my triumphs unremarkable, and my struggles invisible. That feeling of invisibility, of being unheard, became the bedrock of my identity. It shaped every friendship, every romantic relationship, every decision I made for the better part of my life. It was a constant ache, a phantom limb pain for a mother-daughter bond that was never truly formed. For a long time, I didn't even have a name for it. It just was. My normal. It wasn't until I was well into adulthood, navigating my own complex relationships and battling my own internal demons, that I started to understand the profound damage that quiet absence had wrought. I realized I was perpetually seeking validation, approval, and love from everyone but myself, because I hadn't received it from the one person whose love a child instinctively relies on. I was an adult, but inside, a small, neglected child still cried out, desperate to be noticed, desperate to be cherished. And the anger? The anger was a slow burn, a simmering resentment that would flare up unexpectedly, consuming me, making me bitter, guarded, and perpetually on edge. It was an anger that felt righteous, justified, an anger that chained me to my past, to her. I held on to it like a shield, but it was also a prison. So why am I telling you this? Because for years, I believed that forgiving her was an impossibility, an act of betrayal against my younger self, against the hurt that was so real, so profound. I thought forgiveness meant excusing, forgetting, or pretending the pain never happened. But I was wrong. My journey to understanding, to confronting, and ultimately to forgiving my mother for years of emotional neglect was the hardest, most necessary work I've ever done. It wasn't a moment, but a long, arduous process filled with tears, painful truths, raw honesty, and moments where I wanted to give up entirely. But what I discovered on the other side was not just a fragile peace, but a freedom I never knew was possible. A freedom from the past, a freedom to truly live. This isn't just my story, it's a testament to the quiet power of resilience, to the terrifying beauty of facing your deepest fears, and to the transformative, often misunderstood, power of forgiveness. It's a story about learning to see, learning to speak,
And finally, learning to truly heal. And I want to share every raw, vulnerable detail with you.
I grew up in a quiet, tree-lined suburb of Toronto, a typical middle-class existence. Our house was a colonial revival, solid and well-maintained, always smelling faintly of lemon polish and whatever my mother was baking. From the outside, we were the picture of normalcy. 2 parents, a younger brother, a dog named Max, and a perfectly manicured lawn. We went to church on Sundays, had family dinners every night, and summer vacations to a cottage up north. Everything looked perfect, pristine, a scene ripped straight from a 1980s family sitcom. But inside, beneath the polished surfaces, lay a landscape of emotional barrenness. My mother, Evelyn, was a woman of routines and impeccable standards. She was a homemaker in the truest sense, dedicating herself to creating a perfectly ordered environment. Her hair was always styled, her clothes always pressed, her demeanor composed. She was admired by neighbors for her efficiency, her baking, her garden. She was the kind of woman who organized the school bake sale, volunteered for community events, and never forgot a birthday. On the surface, she was the quintessential good mother, but her love language was strictly practical, providing, organizing, managing. Emotional intimacy, however, was a foreign tongue she simply did not speak. I was a sensitive child, a dreamer. I loved to read, to draw, to lose myself in imaginary worlds. What I craved most was connection, a warm embrace, a deep conversation about my fears or my triumphs. But whenever I tried to express these deeper parts of myself, I was met with a polite nod, a quick change of subject, or a practical solution to an emotional problem. If I cried after a scraped knee, I'd be given a Band-Aid and told to be brave. If I spoke about a friend who hurt my feelings, I'd hear a lecture on how to avoid such people, rather than an acknowledgement of my pain. Her responses were always logical, never empathetic. It was like speaking into a void, my words dissolving before they reached her. I quickly learned to manage my own emotions. I learned to bottle things up, to present a cheerful, capable front. To be easy was to be tolerated, maybe even implicitly approved of. If I was too loud, too sad, too exuberant, I felt a subtle withdrawal from her, a shift in her energy that communicated displeasure. So I became a quiet observer, always watching, always trying to decode the unspoken rules of our household. I spent hours alone in my room, not because I was banished, but because it was the only place I felt truly free to be myself, to feel what I felt, without judgment or the crushing weight of expectation. My father, Arthur, was a quiet man, an engineer. He adored my mother in his own way, and seemed content with their domestic rhythm. He was kind, gentle, but equally emotionally distant, perhaps even more so. He often retreated into his workshop or his books, leaving my mother to manage the household, and by extension, our emotional landscape, which she did with a firm, if gentle, hand. He never intervened, never challenged my mother's approach, or perhaps he simply didn't notice the emotional void. It was just how things were. Their marriage seemed to function on mutual respect and shared responsibilities, but certainly not on passionate emotional connection. It was a partnership of 2 people living parallel lives, and my brother and I were simply passengers in their perfectly organized, emotionally sparse world. My younger brother, David, seemed to navigate this environment with more ease. He was boisterous, charming, and seemed to require less emotional validation, or at least he sought it in different ways. He was the golden child in many respects, bringing home good grades with less effort, excelling at sports, and possessing an easygoing temperament that made him less prone to the silent struggles I endured.
I often felt a pang of envy watching my mother laugh at his jokes or celebrate his achievements with a genuine smile that felt rare when directed at me. It wasn't malicious, not from her, but it reinforced my feeling that I was simply different, more complicated, less worthy of her attention or effusive affection. Growing up, I longed for a normal mother-daughter relationship. I devoured books and watched movies where mothers and daughters shared secrets, painted nails, cried together, and offered boundless comfort. These depictions felt like sci-fi to me, fantastical and utterly out of reach. My mother and I would go shopping, yes, and she'd pick out practical clothes for me. We'd bake together, following recipes to the letter, but there was no spontaneous joy, no intimate chatter. It was a functional activity, another task to be completed. I craved a hug, a genuine "I love you, honey," that wasn't tied to a holiday or a formal occasion. But those words, when they came, were often stiff, almost rehearsed, lacking the genuine warmth I desperately needed. So I learned early on that the world was a place where I had to earn my own solace, forge my own connections, and largely parent myself emotionally. I built walls, not of malice, but out of self-preservation. I became fiercely independent, a high achiever in school, driven by an unarticulated need to prove my worth, to become so undeniably good that perhaps, just perhaps, I would finally be seen, finally be acknowledged, finally be loved in the way I yearned for. But even my greatest successes felt hollow without that foundational emotional resonance from my mother. It was a constant, exhausting cycle, and the scars of that quiet, consistent neglect began to form deep within my developing psyche, shaping the woman I was destined to become.
As I transitioned from childhood into the tumultuous waters of adolescence, the emotional disconnect with my mother became less a quiet hum and more a roaring silence. The subtle withdrawal I felt as a child grew into a palpable barrier. Teenage years are inherently fraught with self-doubt and a desperate need for understanding, for validation, for someone to help navigate the bewildering journey of identity. For me, these years were amplified by the persistent feeling of being an outsider in my own family. I started to actively seek out the connection I lacked at home, often in unhealthy ways. Friendships became intensely charged. I was fiercely loyal, often to a fault, because the thought of abandonment was terrifying. I found myself drawn to strong, often charismatic personalities, hoping their light would somehow reflect onto me, making me feel visible. I became a people pleaser, bending over backwards to gain approval, sacrificing my own needs and desires to maintain harmony, to avoid any potential conflict or rejection. I was desperate to be liked, to be needed, to feel any kind of emotional resonance with another human being. My attempts to bridge the gap with my mother during this time were met with consistent, heartbreaking futility. I remember one particular instance vividly. I was 15, grappling with my first real heartbreak. A boy I had a crush on, someone I genuinely liked, had chosen to ask out my best friend. It felt like the end of the world. I locked myself in my room, sobbing uncontrollably. My mother, hearing the muffled cries, knocked on my door. My heart leaped. This was it, I thought. This was the moment she would hold me, tell me it was okay, reassure me. She came in, stood at the foot of my bed, her arms crossed. Her expression was not one of comfort, but of mild exasperation. "What is all this fuss about, Clara?" she asked, her voice calm, devoid of any warmth. I tried to explain, between gasps and tears, the crushing pain, the humiliation. She listened, impassively, then said, "Well, boys will be boys. This isn't worth crying over. You'll have plenty of other crushes. Now dry your eyes, you have a history test tomorrow, and you don't want to go in looking like that." She handed me a tissue,
patted my leg awkwardly, and left. The door closed, and with it the last sliver of hope that she could ever truly understand, truly comfort me. My sobs turned into silent, bitter tears of profound loneliness. It was a crushing revelation. She simply couldn't give me what I needed, not because she wouldn't, but because she couldn't. This incident wasn't isolated. It was a pattern. When I got into my first choice university, a highly competitive program, her reaction was, "Good, that's what we expected." No effusive praise, no proud hugs, just a quiet confirmation of what she already believed I should achieve. When I struggled with anxiety during my first year away from home, feeling overwhelmed and out of my depth, my phone calls to her were met with advice to pull myself together or focus on my studies. Practical, logical, but utterly devoid of emotional support. I started to censor myself, only sharing surface-level details of my life with her, creating an even wider chasm between us. As I entered adulthood, the neglect began to manifest in my closest relationships. I struggled with true intimacy. I was terrified of showing vulnerability, convinced that if people saw the real me, the messy, emotional me, they would abandon me. I constantly sought external validation, whether it was through career achievements, elaborate social plans, or the fleeting approval of others. I dated men who were often emotionally unavailable themselves, recreating the familiar dynamic of yearning for love that was just out of reach. I was unconsciously seeking to fix the original wound by repeatedly subjecting myself to similar patterns, hoping for a different outcome. There was a particularly toxic relationship in my mid-20s. He was charming, intelligent, but also manipulative and emotionally withholding. I stayed for far too long, convinced that if I just tried harder, loved him enough, he would finally see me, truly cherish me. It mirrored my dynamic with my mother with chilling accuracy. My friends saw it, my therapist, who I'd started seeing for general anxiety, saw it, but I was blind. Or rather, I was so desperate for any kind of intense connection, even a painful one, that I clung to it. The fights were brutal, the silent treatments agonizing. I was constantly walking on eggshells, trying to anticipate his moods, trying to be what he wanted me to be. It was exhausting, utterly soul-crushing. One evening, after another particularly nasty argument where he had dismissed my feelings entirely, accusing me of being too emotional, I found myself curled on my bathroom floor, sobbing. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, my eyes red and swollen, and for the first time I saw not just the pain, but the pattern. The familiar pattern of begging for emotional crumbs, of feeling invisible and unvalued. It hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about him. This was about her. This was about the deep, ingrained wound of believing I wasn't worthy of unconditional emotional love, a wound my mother had inadvertently inflicted. That night, lying on the cold tile, the full weight of my childhood neglect and its devastating impact on my adult life finally crashed down on me. It was a revelation that was both devastating and terrifyingly illuminating. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this.
The realization on my bathroom floor was a slow burning fuse that finally ignited a firestorm within me. I ended that toxic relationship a week later, a monumental feat given my deep-seated fear of abandonment. But that was just the beginning. The lingering echoes of that breakup, coupled with the profound insight into its origins, propelled me further into therapy. I stopped seeing it as a way to manage general anxiety and started seeing it as a journey into the heart of my past, a necessary excavation of deeply buried pain. My therapist, Dr. Evans, was a kind, insightful woman with a gentle but firm approach. Week after week, we peeled back layers, revisiting childhood memories, dissecting conversations, and naming the emotions I'd suppressed for so long. We talked about attunement, mirroring, unconditional positive regard, all the things a child needs from a parent, and all the things I hadn't received. The term emotional neglect came up, and it was like a key unlocking a hidden room. It wasn't just a vague feeling anymore. It had a name, a recognized form of trauma. Understanding it intellectually was one thing. Feeling it in my bones, acknowledging the profound hurt, was another entirely. The decision to confront my mother didn't come lightly. It was Dr. Evans who gently suggested it, not as a demand for an apology, but as an act of self-liberation, a way to speak my truth, even if it changed nothing in the dynamic with my mother. The idea filled me with dread. What if she dismissed me? What if she got angry? What if she cried and I felt guilty? All the old fears of being too much, too emotional, too inconvenient resurfaced. But the alternative, staying silent, felt worse. I was tired of carrying the burden alone. I was tired of the resentment that gnawed at me. I was tired of feeling like a perpetually wounded child. So I rehearsed. I wrote letters I never sent. I role-played with Dr. Evans. I imagined every possible scenario, preparing for the worst, hoping for something. The opportunity arose during a quiet Sunday afternoon visit to my parents' house. My father was out playing golf, and David was busy with his own life. It was just my mother and me, sitting in the impeccably clean living room, sipping tea. The air was thick with the usual polite small talk about the weather, my job, her garden. My heart was pounding so hard I thought she must surely hear it. I took a deep breath. "Mom," I started, my voice trembling slightly. "There's something important I need to talk to you about. Something about us." She looked up, her expression neutral. "Oh, is everything all right, dear? Your voice sounds a bit tight." She put her teacup down carefully, her movements precise. She seemed almost braced, yet utterly calm. "It's not about today," I continued, finding strength I didn't know possessed. "It's about my childhood, about how I felt growing up." I watched her face for any flicker of emotion, any sign of recognition. There was none, just that polite, almost detached attention. I started slowly, carefully. "Mom, I always felt very alone. I often felt like you didn't see me, not really, that my feelings weren't important." I recounted the incident with the boy who chose my friend, the tears I'd cried, her dismissive response. I told her about the anxiety I felt in college and how her advice to pull yourself together had made me feel even more isolated. I spoke about the constant need for validation, the people-pleasing, the way it had affected my adult relationships. I tried to use I statements to focus on my experience, not to blame her. Her reaction was unexpected, and yet exactly what I feared. There was no sudden understanding, no outpouring of regret. Her brow furrowed slightly, a faint line of confusion. "Alone? Clara, what are you talking about? You had a perfectly good childhood, a roof over your head, food on the table, nice clothes. We made sure you had everything you needed. My father and I worked hard to give you a good life. We were always there." "But you weren't there emotionally, Mom," I pressed, my voice gaining conviction despite the lump forming in my throat. I needed comfort. I needed to talk about how I felt, not just hear practical solutions. I needed to feel like you truly cared about my inner world. She shifted in her armchair. "Well, I don't know what you expect, Clara. My parents weren't exactly for inner worlds. We didn't sit around talking about our feelings. We got on with things. Life is about doing, not dwelling. I tried to teach you resilience." Her tone was not defensive or angry, but genuinely bewildered, as if I were speaking a foreign language. "I loved you. Of course I loved you. I still do. I did my best. No parent is perfect." My heart sank. It was like hitting a brick wall made of concrete and good intentions. She wasn't denying she loved me, but she was utterly incapable of grasping the kind of love I was talking about. Her love was an action, a provision, a structure. My love was a feeling, a connection, a resonance. They were two entirely different concepts.
I tried one more time. Mom, when I was struggling, when I was hurt, I needed you to listen, to empathize, not to fix it, but to just be there with my pain. She sighed, a small, weary sound. I suppose I'm just not like that, Clara. I never have been. I tried to raise you to be strong. Perhaps I didn't know how to give you what you wanted. She looked away, out the window, a rare moment of vulnerability, but it was fleeting. Is that what this is about? You feel I wasn't enough? In that moment, a profound shift happened within me. I saw her not just as my mother, the source of my pain, but as a person limited by her own upbringing, her own emotional landscape. She genuinely believed she had done her best, and in her own way she had, but her best wasn't what I needed, and she simply didn't possess the tools to provide it. The recognition of her limitation, the understanding that she couldn't give what she didn't have, was a heartbreaking, liberating truth. I didn't get an apology that day. I didn't get a sudden, tearful embrace where everything was magically healed. What I got was a quiet, almost resigned admission of her own emotional boundaries. And in that admission, painful as it was, lay the seeds of something new. It was a clear, unambiguous turning point. I had spoken my truth, and she had shown me hers. The conversation itself hadn't changed her, but it had irrevocably changed me. I walked out of that house that day not with the closure I desperately hoped for, but with a new, profound sense of clarity. The realization hit me. My healing wasn't dependent on her understanding or her apology. It was dependent on my understanding and my ability to accept what was.
Leaving my mother's house after that conversation, I felt a strange mix of profound disappointment and an unexpected, nascent sense of liberation. The air outside felt sharper. Colors seemed more vivid, but my heart ached with a deep, hollow pang. I hadn't gotten the cathartic breakthrough I'd unconsciously yearned for. The tears, the apologies, the sudden embrace of mutual understanding. Instead, I'd been met with a quiet, bewildered resignation. It was a quiet confirmation that the mother I longed for simply did not and perhaps could not exist. The immediate fallout was an overwhelming sense of grief. It wasn't a dramatic, outward expression of sorrow, but a deep internal mourning. I grieved for the childhood I never had, for the mother-daughter relationship I had always idealized and desperately wished for. I grieved for the little girl who felt invisible, whose emotional needs were consistently unmet. This grief manifested as profound sadness, a lethargy that made simple tasks feel monumental, and a pervasive sense of emptiness. I cried often, sometimes for no apparent reason, finding solace only in the quiet solitude of my apartment. The conversation, or lack thereof, had also opened a new floodgate of anger. The resentment, which I thought I had somewhat managed in therapy, flared up with renewed intensity. It wasn't just about the past anymore, it was about the present, about her inability to even see my pain when it was laid bare before her. How could she not understand? How could she be so oblivious? I found myself replaying our conversation endlessly, dissecting her words, her tone, her averted gaze, searching for any sign of empathy, any crack in her emotional armor. Finding none fueled the fire, making me feel unjustly accused, misunderstood, and profoundly alone in my truth. For a period, my relationship with my mother became even more strained, if that was possible. I found it incredibly difficult to engage in superficial conversations. Every phone call felt like a performance, a careful dance around the elephant in the room. I felt a constant internal battle. Part of me wanted to pull away completely, to cut ties and protect myself from further disappointment. Another part, the still wounded child, yearned for her approval, for her to suddenly wake up and say, "I get it, I'm sorry."
I limited my visits, always finding an excuse, because the emotional energy required to be around her, to navigate that familiar distance, felt too draining. This emotional turmoil, however, was also a catalyst for deeper engagement in therapy. Dr. Evans became my anchor. We spent countless sessions processing the anger, the grief, the frustration. She helped me understand that my mother's reaction wasn't a personal attack, but a reflection of her own limitations, her own emotional upbringing. "She gave you what she had, Clara," Dr. Evans would say gently. "It wasn't enough for you, and that's a painful truth. But it doesn't mean she didn't love you in the only way she knew how." This was a difficult pill to swallow. It didn't excuse the pain, but it began to shift my perspective from blame to understanding, from personal affront to a more objective assessment of intergenerational patterns. I began to set boundaries, initially tentatively, then with more conviction. When my mother would subtly dismiss my feelings or offer unsolicited advice, I learned to say, "Mom, I appreciate your perspective, but I just need you to listen right now." Or, "I'm not looking for a solution, just to share what I'm feeling." These small acts of self-advocacy felt revolutionary, terrifying, and empowering all at once. Sometimes she would pause, slightly flustered, and other times she would revert to her old patterns. But I was changing. I was honoring my needs, even if she couldn't always meet them. The consequences also rippled into my other relationships. The old people-pleasing tendencies, the fear of vulnerability resurfaced. But now, with the insights from therapy, I was better equipped to recognize and challenge them. I started choosing friends who were emotionally mature, who could offer genuine empathy and reciprocal support. I began to articulate my needs in relationships, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes imperfectly, but always authentically. It meant some relationships shifted, some friendships faded because they couldn't withstand the new Clara who wasn't willing to carry all the emotional labor. It was painful, but also clarifying. I was finally building a life and a support system that truly nourished me, rather than constantly draining me. There were moments of immense loneliness during this period. The realization that I might never have the movie mother-daughter bond was a constant ache. I'd see friends laughing with their mothers, sharing secrets, and a wave of profound sadness would wash over me. It felt like a fundamental part of me was missing, a void that couldn't be filled. But I also started to recognize the strength I had cultivated. The resilience born from navigating that emotional landscape alone was now a superpower. I had learned to self-soothe, to trust my own judgment, to validate my own emotions. These were hard-won lessons, forged in the crucible of neglect, but they were mine. I spent nearly 2 years in this intense period of processing, grieving, and rebuilding. It was exhausting, emotionally draining work, but it was essential. I was slowly, painstakingly reparenting myself. I was learning to be the comforting, empathetic mother to myself that I had never had. I bought myself flowers, wrote myself affirmations, took myself on walks, and allowed myself to feel every messy, uncomfortable emotion without judgment. The fallout of that confrontation was not a tidy resolution, but a messy, transformative journey into the depths of my own emotional landscape, where I was forced to confront my deepest wounds and begin the arduous yet ultimately empowering work of healing them myself.
The journey from the deep well of neglect to the fragile, hard-won peace I now inhabit has been the most transformative experience of my life. It wasn't a sudden epiphany, no dramatic movie-style reconciliation with my mother where all was forgiven in a tearful embrace. My resolution, my path to forgiveness, was far more nuanced, more internal, and ultimately more profound. After that initial confrontation and the ensuing period of intense grief and anger, I realized that true healing wouldn't come from changing my mother. It had to come from within me. Dr. Evans helped me understand that forgiveness wasn't about excusing her behavior or pretending it didn't hurt. It was about releasing myself from the emotional chains of resentment, bitterness, and the constant longing for something that wasn't going to materialize. It was about acknowledging the past, accepting its reality, and then choosing to move forward without carrying the crushing weight of that pain into my present and future. This involved a conscious, daily practice. I started by writing letters to my younger self, validating her feelings, telling her she was seen, loved, and worthy, something I so desperately needed to hear. I practiced radical self-compassion, treating myself with the kindness and understanding I had always yearned for from my mother. When old feelings of inadequacy or invisibility crept in, I learned to gently acknowledge them, offer myself comfort, and then consciously redirect my focus to the present, to the person I had become, the person who was capable of loving and validating herself. My relationship with my mother didn't undergo a miraculous transformation. It evolved, slowly, into something different. I no longer approached our interactions with the expectation that she would suddenly become the mother I needed. Instead, I accepted her for who she was, a woman limited by her own experiences, her own emotional architecture. I learned to appreciate the love she could offer, the practical support, her genuine interest in my external achievements, her quiet presence. I learned to love her for the mother she was, not the mother I desperately wished she could be. This meant adjusting my own expectations, creating emotional boundaries that protected my inner child, and seeking my deepest emotional needs from other healthy sources, my chosen family of friends, my partner, and most importantly, myself. When we spoke, the conversations remained largely superficial, focusing on everyday happenings, but occasionally there would be small shifts. I remember one Christmas, she saw a piece of art I had done for my apartment, a vibrant abstract painting. Instead of her usual pragmatic comment about whether it matched the decor, she paused, really looked at it, and said, "That's very expressive, Clara. You have a real flair for color." It was a small thing, but for me, it was a profound acknowledgement of a part of my inner world she had rarely seen or commented on. In those moments, I felt a gentle warmth, not because she had changed fundamentally, but because I had changed my lens. I was no longer searching for the grand gesture, but appreciating the tiny sparks of connection that were within her capacity. Forgiveness, I discovered, isn't a one-time event. It's a continuous process, a choice made repeatedly. There are still days when the old wounds ache, when a fleeting comment or a distant look can trigger a familiar pang of sadness. But now, instead of spiraling into anger or self-pity, I can acknowledge the pain, comfort my inner child, and then consciously choose to release the resentment. I understand that her emotional neglect wasn't a deliberate act of malice, but a deeply ingrained pattern, a product of her own life story. This understanding doesn't erase the pain, but it disentangles me from its grip. It allows me to see her with compassion, and more importantly, to see myself with profound compassion. My lesson in life, the core truth I want to share with you, is this. You cannot force someone else to heal, or to change, or to give you the love they are incapable of giving. But you can heal yourself. You can choose to break the cycle of pain. You can choose to stop waiting for an apology that might never come, and instead give yourself the validation and love you deserve. Forgiveness is not about absolving the other person. It is about freeing yourself. It is about reclaiming your power, your peace, and your future. It's about saying, "This happened, it hurt, but it will not define me anymore." Today, I am not without scars, but they are no longer bleeding wounds. They are badges of resilience, reminders of how far I've come. I have built a life rich with genuine connections, deep friendships, and a loving, emotionally available partner. I've learned to trust my own voice, to honor my own feelings, and to cultivate a deep sense of self-worth that no external validation can shake. The silence that once haunted me has been replaced by the comforting hum of my own internal peace, a peace I found not by changing my mother, but by finally, truly forgiving her, and in doing so, freeing myself.
Growing up feeling invisible left deep scars, but I finally faced my fears and confronted my mother. My story is one of resilience, painful truths, and the power of forgiveness.